Alright, what's going on everyone? In this video we're going to be making a Vue 3 modal component. So if I go ahead and click on our button right here on our screen, currently have open modal, this will go ahead and populate what we're going to be building here inside of this video. Now to construct this modal component we're going to be using the composition API, we're going to be using slots and props as well as the enter and leave transitions that Vue goes ahead and provides us to make our modal animate in and out very smoothly. So if I click on the button right here to close it, you'll see that it exit our screen very smoothly, and if I go ahead and open it back up, you'll see that it also enters very smoothly here. So that's what we're going to be building here today, so let's go ahead and get started. Now really quick before we jump into the video here, if you want to support the channel and the free content that I am making here on YouTube, you now have the ability to join my channel. So you're going to see this button here called join on the actual channel homepage. Now when you click on this, it's going to populate a modal here, which is going to allow you to join my channel for $2.99 a month. Now, not only are you supporting me and the free content that I'm making here on YouTube, but you're also going to get loyalty badges next to your name whenever you leave a comment on one of my videos. Now, in addition to this, you're also going to get credited inside of my video outro and video descriptions. Now for this project, we are going to be utilizing the Vue CLI to create our Vue application here. Now to utilize this, first off, what you need to have is Node.js installed on your system. Now you may already have it installed and don't know it. Now to check, what you can do is if you're on Mac, open up a terminal. If you're on Windows, open up a command prompt and run the command node-v here. And if you get return a version here, that means you have Node installed on your system and that you're going to be all set to actually utilize and install the Vue CLI on your system. Now if you don't, then click on one of these options right here and go through the installation steps and install Node onto your system. All right, now the second thing that you need to have is actually the Vue CLI itself. So if you don't have it, all you need to do is come over here to the documentation. I'll go ahead and have a link down below in the description, and you want to run this command right here of npm install -g at vue/CLI, and that'll go ahead and install the Vue CLI onto your system so that you can go ahead and create a Vue application and follow along with me. Now, once again, if you don't know if you already have this installed, all you need to do is come over to your terminal or command prompt and run the command vue ---- or ---- and we'll say version here. And you can see that if you do have it installed, you'll get returned this value right here at Vue CLI and the current version that you have on your system. Now, assuming you have all that installed, we're now ready to get started here. So inside of VS Code, I have an empty folder called Vue 3 Modal. Now, the first thing we want to go ahead and do is use the Vue CLI to create our Vue project here. So what I'm going to do is come up to my terminal tab here and select a new terminal. And we're going to go ahead and run the command to create our Vue project using the Vue CLI. So how we can do this is by saying Vue create and pass the name of the project that we want to go ahead and create. Now, since I'm already inside of the Vue 3 Modal folder, I'm going to go ahead and call this project app here. And this is going to open up the interface here inside of our terminal, which is going to allow us to pick a preset, or we can manually select our features here. So for the sake of this video, what I'm going to do is go ahead all the way to the bottom and do manually select features here and go ahead and select enter. Now we want to go ahead and pick some of the features that we want for this specific project, and what we're going to need is the router, which I'm going to go ahead and select over, go over it and hit space, and also a CSS preprocessor, which I'll hit space over that as well, and we can go ahead and enter on here. Now it's going to ask us which version of Vue.js we want to start the project with. We'll go ahead and select 3. We're going to be using the history mode for our router, so we'll select yes here. And then for our preprocess here, we'll go ahead and use Node Sass, and then we'll go ahead and leave all the rest of the options here as default. So we'll do that for our linter. We'll do lint on save, and for the config files, we'll go ahead and store these inside of a dedicated config file. And we do have the option to save this preset for future projects, but for the sake of this video, I'm just going to go ahead and select no, and that's going to go ahead and start to create our Vue application here. So some time has passed and we have now successfully created our Vue application here. And we can see this if we head over to our app folder here inside of our Vue 3 folder, and we expand this, and we're going to see all these files that were generated by the Vue CLI. Now the first thing we want to go ahead and do is actually change directories into this folder of apps. So we're going to say cd and do app here. Now, next up, what we want to do is spin up our local development server, which is going to serve our Vue application inside of our browser. So we can do this by running the command npm run serve like this, and it's going to start up the local development server, and we should be served some URLs right here. So you can see our app is running on our local host of 8081. Now, this may differ depending on if you have other things running on your local host, which I do. So we'll go ahead and open this up inside of our browser, and you can see here, this is the default configuration, or I should say template, that Vue generates when you create or use the Vue CLI. Now, we don't need all this stuff that we currently have inside of our project, so let's go ahead and do some cleanup here. Now, here inside of our app folder, let's navigate into our SRC folder, which is where we want to do our cleanup at. So inside of this folder, let's start inside of our views folder here. Now, we have this about view and we have this home view. Now, for this project and tutorial, we're only going to be utilizing our home view here. So we don't need our about view. So let's go ahead and open this up, and we're going to delete it. Okay. Now, this view is also imported inside of our router, so we need to go ahead and remove it from here as well. So inside of the router folder, we have an index.js, and we have this path right here of about, which is importing the component, so we also want to remove this as well. Now, what we also want to do is inside of our home view itself, we have this image and we have this component of hello world, which we don't need. So I'm going to go ahead and remove this from here. Now, we also need to remove the import statement here inside of our script tag, and also the hello world inside of our component option here. So let's go ahead and remove that. Now, as for the hello world component itself, which is found inside of the components folder here, we don't have any need for this. So let's go ahead and open this up, and we're going to remove it like that. We'll just go ahead and delete it. Now, inside of our assets folder here, we have that logo.png that was imported into the hello world component, or it might have been the home view here. So we're no longer using this, so there's no need to have it inside of this repository or our project here. So let's go ahead and delete this. And then the last thing we need to do is inside of our app.view here, we have this navigation. So if we head back over to our browser, you can see we have this navigation left over, which we don't need. So all we're going to do is remove this div with the ID of nav, and then I'll go ahead and remove that from here as well. Okay. Now, while we're inside of the app.view, what I want to do here is we have this styling. So I'm going to go ahead and remove this, and then I'm going to do a simple reset here on our entire project, and we're going to say margin 0, and we're going to say padding, set that to 0, and we're going to do box sizing, and we'll do border box here. Okay, so now if we head back over to our application and our browser here, this is going to give us a fresh, clean slate to begin working on our modal component. Now, for our modal component, we are going to be using the Font Awesome library as well as a Google font to make things look a little bit better for this tutorial here. So let's go ahead and head over to our browser and start off with importing our Google font here into our project. So I've already selected the font here we're going to be using, called Carla, and I've already selected the option of the import directive here. So all we need to do is copy this within the style tags right here, and we need to paste this inside of our app.view and within our style tags here. Now, we also need to specify the font family, so let's go ahead and copy this right below the import directive here, and we'll paste this inside of a reset here. Okay, so now we have successfully went ahead and imported our Google font into our application here. So the next thing that we want to do is import the Font Awesome library. So I'm going to head over to cdnjs.com, and you can search up for Font Awesome here in the search bar. And we're going to use this first option right here for our Font Awesome library. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this link tag here. Now, to use this, we need to head over to our public folder, or to import it, we got to head over to our public folder, and we need to select the index.html. Now, just above our title here, I'm going to go ahead and do a line break, and we're going to copy and paste in this link tag here, which is going to give us the ability to have access to the Font Awesome library inside of our Vue project. Now, with that out of the way, let's go ahead and actually create our modal component itself here. So inside of our components folder right here, what we're going to do is we're going to right click on it and do new file, and we'll say modal.view here. Okay, so let's start off by generating our Vue template here. I'm going to do this with Vue, and I'm going to do tab. That's going to create this Vue template here. Now, for this component, we are going to be accepting one prop, which is going to be the modal active prop, which is going to control whether or not our modal is visible or it isn't. So we'll define props here, and we'll go ahead and say modal active here. Now, the reason why I wanted to create this initially before we start any of our markup is because we are going to be utilizing this prop inside of our markup itself. So it makes sense to create this before we get started. So let's go ahead and first off create our markup here. So what I want to do is we're going to wrap our entire modal component here in a transition tag. Okay, so we'll say, oops, let's try, it doesn't like when I do this. So we'll say transition here and we'll give it a name here and we'll say modal animation, and let's go ahead and close this up and we'll say /transition here. Now inside of this transition tag, what we're going to do is we're going to have another div which is going to have the class of modal here. Okay, now we only want to show this if, let's see here, we'll say vShow if the prop of modal active is true here. Okay, now inside of this we're going to also have another transition tag because we want to have two separate transitions here, because the way we're going to animate this is going to be on the initial actual modal itself, and we're also going to need to do a transition or an animation on the modal content, or the modal inner, we're going to call that. So we'll do one more transition tag here. We'll say transition, we'll do name, and this is going to be modal animation, and we'll say inner. Okay, and then we'll say, we'll close that up. Now inside of here, what we're going to do is we're going to have another div which is going to have the class of modal inner, and we're also going to do a vShow of the same prop here of modal active like this. Okay, now inside of here we're going to use our font awesome icon. So if we head back over to our browser here, I already have this pulled up here. We're going to be using the icon of this times circle. Now this is available with the free version, but if you have a paid version of Font Awesome, feel free to use whatever close icon you want or any kind of icon you want. But for this tutorial, I'm going to go ahead and use this free icon right here. So we'll go ahead and copy this, and we'll go ahead and paste this here inside of the modal inner. Now, to make this modal dynamic and allow you to enter any content you want into this modal, we're going to be using what they call a slot here. Okay, so we'll say slot like that. Now we'll go ahead and go over this more once we actually import this component into our actual home view here. But for now, this is where we'll go ahead and do a comment here. We're going to say this is the modal content like that. Okay, now in addition to this, I also want to have an actual close button on our modal here, so that we only don't have the close in the top right hand corner. We'll also have a button within our modal that's going to allow us to close the modal too. So we're going to have two different spots that we can actually exit our modal here. So let's go ahead and create our button here. And we'll go ahead and just pass the value of close in here. And sorry, I just hit the mic here. So that's going to go ahead and do it for our markup. Now, before we go ahead and get into the styling here, I want to first import this component into our home view. So first off, let's start by importing our modal component here into our home view. So inside of our script tag here, we'll say import, and then we'll say modal, and from, and then we'll assign the path of where this modal is located. So we're going to go into our components folder here, and then we'll say modal. Now we can also get rid of the dot here and just assign the @ sign, which looks a little bit cleaner in my opinion, and that'll be the same thing as assigning it dot. Okay, now inside of our components property here, we also need to say modal like this, and now we'll have access to use this inside of our markup here. Okay, so let's go ahead and open up our modal tags here. Now, like I mentioned before, we are using slots, so we're going to have an opening modal tag here and then also a closing modal tag. All right, so inside of here, what I'm going to do is we're going to have a div with the class of modal content. Now, this is a demo for the modal, so all I'm going to do is have an h1 here, and we'll say this is a modal header. And then we'll have a paragraph tag here and say this is a, we'll do, modal message like this. Now, since we are using slots, you could go ahead and enter anything you want into this in between these modal tags, but for the sake of this video, I'm going to keep it simple, and we're going to have an h1 and just a paragraph tag here. Okay, now currently if we go back to our modal component here, you'll see that we're only going to show this if the prop of modal active is true, and we are not assigning a property or a prop here on our modal component just yet. So let's go ahead and create that. So just below our components property here, let's go ahead and open up our setup option here. Okay, now inside of here we need to create our data. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new data value here, and we're going to call this modal active. And we'll set this equal to a ref here. And initially we'll say this is true because I want to show this so we can see what we're doing here. Okay. Now to use ref inside of the setup option here, we need to import it up top right below our modal component. So our modal component. So we'll say import and we'll do our curly brackets here, ref, and then we'll say from, and then we'll do view. And now we'll have access to use this inside of our setup option here. Now to use the modal active data value, we need to return it. So we'll say return, and then we'll say modal active like this. And then all we need to do is bind that data value here as a prop to our modal component. So how that's going to look is we'll do the shorthand version here. We'll say colon, and we'll do modal active like this. And then we'll say modal active. Okay, so now if we head back over to our browser here, we should see that we're going to have our modal markup right here. Okay, so currently we have no way to open and close our modal. It is open by default initially, but if you wanted to close it, you can see here if you click on the X button here or the close button, nothing is going to happen. So what we need to do is create a function that's going to update our data value of modal active from true to false and vice versa from false to true. Okay, so let's head over to our home view here and create that function. So just below modal active here, I'll go ahead and create a new function called const toggle modal and set this equal to a arrow function here. Now, what we want to do is we want to update this value from true to false or from false to true. So an easy way to do this, we can say modal active. Now to get the value of this data, we need to specify a modal active dot value here. And we want to set this equal to the opposite of whatever it is. So we'll say exclamation point modal active dot value. So what this function is going to do is if this is true, then it'll set it to false whenever we run this function. And if it is false, what it'll do is set it to true. So it's like a nice toggler between true and false. Okay, now to use this inside of our markup, we need to return it here. So we'll say toggle modal. Now we have no way initially on our home view here to open our modal. So just below our modal component here, I'm going to create a new button and we'll say type button. And then we'll have the content say open modal. Okay, now what we want to do here is we want to pass a click event here, and every time a user clicks this, we want to run the function of toggle modal. Okay, so now if we head over to, actually first off, let's put this to false here so it's not open by default. So now if we head back over to our browser, we should see that we no longer have our modal open. We only have this button here, which looks really ugly. We'll go ahead and style this in just a minute. But now if I click on this, you'll see that it's going to populate and open our modal. Now the problem still exists if we want to close our modal here and we click on the close button or the close icon, nothing is going to happen. So what we need to do is we need to listen for a user to click on either of these two buttons, and then we want to run our toggle modal function. So we're going to do this using a emit. Okay, so back inside of our project here, inside of our modal component, let's first go ahead and define our setup option here. Okay, now if we are using the options API to go ahead and run a custom event, all we'd have to do is say this $money emit, and then we could define the event that we wanted to emit from this component. Now, when we're using the composition API, we just don't have access to this right here. So there's a little bit of a different way we have to do it. Now, the setup option itself accepts two parameters. The first one is props, and the second one is context here. Okay, but we don't need to import the entire context parameter. I want to destructure this and only accept the emit. Okay, so that's how we're going to go ahead and emit out of our modal component using the composition API. Okay, so what we want to do is you want to create a function that's going to run our emit every time we click on the close button here or our icon. Okay, so we'll go ahead and create our function of const, and we'll say close, and set this equal to an arrow function here. And then we're going to say emit here, and then the event that we want to emit is going to be close. Okay, and then to use this actual function inside of our markup, we need to return it. So we'll say return, and then we'll say close. Oops, and close. There we go. Now here inside of our markup, what we'll do is we'll say at click, we'll run close, and the same thing here on our button. We'll say close, and we'll also put a type of button on here as well. Okay, so now here on our modal component, we want to listen for this event. So we'll say at close, and we'll run our function of toggle modal. So now we should be able to open and close our modal successfully here. So let's go over to our browser and test this out. So currently our modal is closed. So if we click on open modal, we should be able to open it. And if we click on close, you'll see that it's going to close. And if we open it again and click on the icon up here, it'll also go ahead and close. So currently our modal component looks a little bit rough, so let's go ahead and fix that by adding some styling to our actual component here. So we'll start off here inside of our home.view, and we need to actually create our style tags here. So we'll look for the SCSS scoped, and then we'll go ahead and do or select our home class here. And we're first going to give this a background color here, and we'll go ahead and say RGBA, and we'll say 0, 176, 234, and then we'll pass a 50% opacity here. Then what we want to do is give this a height of 100 VH. We're going to display this as flex. Now we want to align all the content to the middle of the screen. So how we can do that is by saying justify content to the center here, and then align items to the center as well. Okay, now we're going to be using, or we have this button right here, and we also have the button inside of our modal component here. Now what I want to do to save some styling here is I want to apply our button styling globally here. So we're going to do that inside of our actual app.view here. So we'll come over here and we'll say button. We're going to give it a padding value of 20 pixels, and then we'll say 30 pixels. And then what we also want to do is we want to pass the border value, and we're going to set that to none. We're going to give it a font size here of 16 pixels, and we're going to give it a background color, and we're going to say crimson here. And then what we want to do is we want to make the text color, we're going to set that to white, and then we're also going to say a cursor of pointer here. Okay, so with that defined, if we head back over to our browser, now you'll see that our button looks a lot better, and if we open it, you'll see that the button here inside of our modal component also is the same. Okay, so what I want to do next is head back over to our home view. And then what we need to do is actually style up our modal content here. Okay, so inside of this home selector, we'll say modal, and we'll say content here. And then we're going to set this to display flex, and we want this to be in a column. So we'll say flex direction here, and we'll set this to column like that. Okay, and then we'll do inside of here, we'll do some shared styling. So we have our H1 and our paragraph tag here. And what I want to do is provide a margin bottom of 16 pixels on both of these here. And then I want to target our H1 here, and we're going to give this a font size, and we'll say 32 pixels. And then all I want to do for our paragraph here, let's scroll down, is I want to give it a little bit of a larger size as well, and we'll say font size, and we'll do 18 pixels here. Okay, so if we head back over to our modal, things should start to be looking a little bit better, but we still have some work to do. Okay, so that's going to come on our modal component itself here. So let's head over to our modal component here, and we already have our style tags defined, but what I'll do here is I'll just remove those, and we'll replace those with the scoped style tags here. Okay, so what we want to do is we want to target our first class here of modal itself. So we'll say dot modal here, oops, let's say dot modal, and then what we want to do is we want to display this as flex. We're going to justify the content to the center, and we're also going to align the items to the center as well. Okay, now what we also want to do is I want to provide this a height of 100 VH, and we'll do a width of 100 VW. Okay, and then we also want to position our modal fixed. So we'll say position, let's see, position here, and we'll provide the value of fixed here. And then we're going to say top 0, oops, top 0, and then we'll say left 0. And then we also want to give this a background color here, and we're going to do, let's see, white like this, but I'm also going to provide it a opacity. So we're going to say RGBA, and then we'll pass it a fourth value here, and we'll say 0.7 like that. Okay, and I believe that's all we need to do for the modal itself. Okay, now inside of our modal, we also have the modal inner here, so let's go ahead and do some styling to that. Okay, so go ahead and define modal inner here, and then what we want to do is we want to position this relative. Then we're going to give this a max width, and we're going to say 640 pixels, but we also want to define it to take up 80% of the width if it is smaller than 640 pixels, if that makes sense. We just don't want it to get any larger than 640 pixels is probably a better way to go ahead and say that. And we're also going to have a box shadow on here, which I'm going to copy and paste in here to save some time. It's a little bit lengthy. Okay, we'll scroll back over here, and then what we want to also do is give this a background color of white, and then we're going to give it a padding around all sides, 64 pixels, and then 16 pixels like that. Okay, now what we also want to do is we have our icon here, so I want to go ahead and do some styling to our icon. So what we want to do is we'll go ahead and target, let's see here, our I class, and we're going to say position absolute, and we want to position this in the top right hand corner, so I'm going to say top, we'll do 15 from the top, and then from the right we'll do 15 as well. Okay, and then we're going to give this a font size here of 20 pixels, and then we're going to do cursor and we'll do pointer like that. And then let's go over and we'll say on the hover here, so we can do that by saying &hover, we'll give this a color and we'll say crimson. Oops, crimson, there we go. And that should go ahead and do it for our styling. So if we head back over to our actual browser and component, we're getting a error here, and that's because we forgot to define RGBA like that. So I should go ahead and fix that. So now if we open our modal, things should look a lot better. And if we hover over our icon here, we can close it, open it, close it. So that is looking a lot better. Now the one problem is you can see here that when we close our modal, it's very abrupt. Now we're going to be using the view transitions of enter and leave to go ahead and animate our modal in and out a lot more smoother. Now really quick, I want to make one slight adjustment here. So for the sake of this video, it made sense to apply our button styling here globally because we are using it inside of our home.view as well as our modal.view. Okay, but for the sake of making this component reusable and very easy to implement, we have too many moving parts, such as this button styling being outside of the scope of our modal component. Now, to make things compact and make this modal component very easy to implement and use without any issues, we should actually have this button styling included within our modal component itself. So I'm going to copy this and we're going to paste this inside of our modal.enter here right below our I tag here. Now earlier on when we created our modal component itself, we wrapped it in these transition tags, which are going to use to animate our modal in and out of the view. Now whenever our modal comes in and comes out, Vue is going to apply classes to it that we can use to animate our modal in and out of the view. So let's go ahead and start off with our first animation here, which is going to be for our whole entire modal itself. And then we're also going to apply some animations that are going to be a little bit different to the content or the modal content itself. So let's go ahead and copy our name here of modal animation and come down to our styling here. And let's go ahead and target a few of the classes Vue gives us to go ahead and animate this. So the first two that I want to target are going to be the active classes, which are going to define the actual transition that we want to define on our modal. So we're going to target enter active, and then we'll also target the leave active here. So I'll go ahead and replace enter with leave. Okay. Now, let's go ahead and put that E back. Now inside of here, what we want to do is we want to define the transition here. So let's say transition, and we want to only transition the opacity here. We want it to happen over 0.3 seconds. And for the easing, we're going to use a custom cubic bezier option here, which we're going to pass a value of 0.52, 0.02, 0.19, and then 1.02 here, okay? And that's going to be our transition. Now, we're going to be transitioning the opacity here. So what I want to do is we're going to target, well, let's go and paste this in modal animation here, enter from. Now we want this to enter from an opacity of 0, so we'll pass the opacity here and set it to 0. Now by default, the opacity will be 1, so we could explicitly go ahead and define, if I copy this like this, we could say enter 2 here and change this to an opacity of 1, but this is already going to be the default option, so we don't need to explicitly define this, okay? Now when the modal is leaving, we want it to leave to the opacity of 0, so the same thing is going to apply here. So we could say leave to, or sorry, leave from here, so we want it to start at 1, and then we want it to go to, let's see here, let's go down here, we could say leave to, and we could set this to 0. But once again, by default, the opacity is already at 1, so we don't need to define that. So we can go ahead and remove this right here. Now, since these two share the same opacity value, we can go ahead and combine these to make our style a little bit more condensed here. So let's go ahead and remove that. And we'll pass a comma here and we'll paste this in. So with this simple styling and these classes right here, we should now see a more smoother transition of an opacity when we open and close our modal. So let's go ahead and check that out here. So let me go ahead and actually close this. Don't know why that's open. So if we refresh it here and we open our modal, you can see that now it comes in a lot more smoothly. And if I close it, it comes out a lot smoother as well. So let's go ahead and work on the animation for our modal content here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this modal animation, enter here, and we'll come down to our styling and we'll go ahead and do a line break here and we'll target this and we'll say enter active here. Now we're going to be using the same transition properties here as we have for our modal animation, enter and leave active. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this right here and we're going to go ahead and paste this inside of here. Now for the interactive on our modal content, I want to add a slight delay to this happening. So what we can do is pass a fourth parameter here and I can define 0.15 seconds. Okay, and then what I want to do is we're going to duplicate this down here for our leave active, and then what we'll do is we'll say leave active like this and we'll remove the delay. Now we don't want to just transition the opacity here, we want to target all. So I'm going to change this from opacity to all here on these two enter and leave active classes. Okay, so what I'm going to do is we're going to copy this once more and we'll come down here and we're going to target the enter from here. Now for this animation, what I want to do is first off, we're going to have the opacity and we're going to set this to 0. Now to make it look like the modal is popping out at you, we want it to start off a little bit smaller. So what we're going to do here is we're going to target the transform here and we're going to set it to scale and we're going to go slightly smaller. So the default is 1, we're going to go 0.08 here. Okay, and then what we want to do next is we can just duplicate this here, and what we'll do is we're going to remove the opacity here because the opacity is going to default go to 0 when we actually transition out of the modal itself, so there's no need to define it here when we're actually leaving. So what I want to do is we're going to change this to leave and we'll say 2 here, and we want the scale to go back down to 0.08 so it looks like the modal is actually going back into the page. Okay, so we could probably do some shared styling here, but either way we're going to have two different selectors for the opacity property here, so you can do what you want for the styling, but this works just fine. So that's going to do it for our animation here. So if I save this, we should now have our modal look like it's coming at us as well as it actually coming in smoothly still when we click on it. So let's go ahead and test this out here. So if we open it now, you'll see that the modal is popping out at us, and when we close it here, it's going to go back into the screen. Okay, so that's going to go ahead and do it for our reusable View 3 modal component. If you guys did enjoy, be sure to leave a like on it down below and subscribe if you guys are new to the channel for more content like this. And I will see you guys in the next one. Take care.